Mist rose over the forests of Wallachia like breath from a dying god. Beneath it, the trees did not move, yet something among them swayed. They were bodies, hundreds of them, impaled upon wooden stakes that reached toward a gray sky. The wind touched them gently, and for a moment they seemed alive again, whispering a sound that no language could name. Among them stood a boy. He did not cry. He did not look away. The scent of blood had already become the air he breathed. His name was Vlad III Dracula, son of Vlad Dracula, a prince whose oath to the Ottoman Empire had turned to betrayal. When his father's allegiance collapsed, the empire demanded payment not in gold, but in blood. The young Vlad and his brother Radu were taken to the city of Edirne, carried away as living hostages of peace. He was told he was safe within the palace walls, but he knew that safety is only another word for obedience. Each step he took was measured, each glance watched, every breath weighed. In this silent captivity, Vlad studied the nature of fear. He saw how the empire ruled not by justice, but by certainty of pain. Punishment was spectacle, designed to carve obedience into memory. He learned that strength alone could be challenged, but terror could rule forever. Mercy was a luxury of the weak, and love was a wound waiting to be used. They called it captivity. For Vlad III Dracula, it was education in the language of fear. If you wish to keep walking through the forgotten corridors of power and cruelty, subscribe to our channel, where every crown still bleeds beneath its jewels. The years in the Ottoman court unfolded like a long, soundless punishment. Vlad III Dracula was no longer a prince of mountains and rivers, but a shadow moving through marble corridors where every whisper could end a life. The palace in Edirne shimmered with gold, yet for him it was only a cage built by diplomacy. Servants bowed, guards watched, and silence ruled over them all. He learned quickly that words were dangerous, that in this world a man survived not by what he said, but by what he concealed. His captors called it education. He studied their language, their customs, their art of control. Every morning he watched men be whipped or beheaded for the smallest offense. The sound of it never shocked him after the first week. It became rhythm, the heartbeat of an empire built on fear. Among those who trained him was an old soldier, a man with eyes like rusted iron. The soldier once told him that mercy only invited the knife to return. Vlad never forgot those words. They planted themselves deep inside him, like seeds waiting for the right season of blood to grow. His younger brother Radu, gentle and fair, became beloved in the court. The sultans praised his obedience, his grace, his easy laughter. Vlad watched him and saw a mirror of everything he could never be. Where Radu learned to charm, Vlad learned to endure. The affection that warmed his brother's life only hardened his own heart. He began to understand that love made a man predictable, and predictable men did not survive. At night, he dreamed of Wallachia, of forests black with crows, of a home now lost behind borders drawn by kings. The humiliation of captivity shaped him in silence. It did not break him. It refined him into something colder than steel. One night, as a storm tore across the horizon, the old soldier found him gazing out at the rain and said that fear breaks men. Vlad turned his eyes to him and answered softly that fear does not break. It teaches. Then lightning struck, splitting the sky in two, and in that brief flash his face changed. The boy who had entered Edirne was gone. In his place stood a prince who would make all of Europe remember his name. Rain poured as he rode into the darkness, leaving behind the empire that had forged him. The thunder carried his promise. The world would soon learn what silence had created. When Vlad III Dracula returned to Wallachia, the land greeted him not with loyalty, but with silence. His father was dead, betrayed by the very nobles who now bent their knees in false devotion. The castles that once sang his family's name had turned into nests of deceit. The boy who left in chains came back as a man who spoke the language of vengeance with the calm of a priest reciting prayer. He did not march with armies. He called for a feast. The Easter of 1459 arrived with banners fluttering above Targovishte, and the lords of Wallachia came dressed in velvet and pride. The great hall glowed with candlelight that trembled like living souls. Gold plates gleamed, wine spilled across the table like rubies, and laughter tried to bury memory. Vlad sat at the head of the banquet, his face serene, his eyes unreadable. Every toast was answered with a smile that felt a heartbeat too slow. As the night deepened, the air thickened with wine and suspicion. Music swelled through the hall, the notes sweet and deceiving. When the doors closed, the sound of strings faded into the hiss of blades drawn from the dark. The guests froze as their host stood and raised his cup one last time. His voice was gentle. He thanked them for their loyalty. Then the candles flickered, and loyalty lost its meaning. What followed was not rage, but precision. Vlad did not destroy his enemies in madness. He dismantled them with the same patience the empire once used to shape him. The nobles who had conspired against his father were judged without words. Their laughter turned to echoes, their glory to dust, outside. The torches painted the walls in red and gold, the colors of divine retribution. When dawn came, the banquet hall smelled not of wine, but iron. The tables were overturned, the feast forgotten, and the throne stood alone amid the quiet ruin of celebration. In that silence, Vlad understood that justice was no longer balance. It was transformation, a reaction between pain and power that could burn away the corruption of an entire world. The sun rose over Wallachia and touched his face with pale light. It did not warm him. It only revealed what had been reborn there. The prince who once bowed before empires had become something far greater and far more dangerous. From that morning on, the throne of Wallachia was no longer carved from stone or gold. It was carved from revenge. The road to Targovishte wound through a valley that smelled of smoke and rain. Traders who dared to travel it said the air itself had changed. It carried a weight that pressed against the lungs, the scent of something that was once alive but now lingered between worlds. When they reached the hill outside the city, the wind shifted and the silence broke. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence that follows screaming. Before them stretched what they later called the forest of the impaled. Thousands of wooden stakes rose from the earth like trees in bloom. The light of dawn passed through them, turning the air gold and red as if the sky itself bled. Crows circled above, their cries lost in the heavy stillness. No one spoke. The merchants covered their faces, but the smell of iron and rot still found them. It clung to their clothes, their skin, their sleep. Vlad III, Dracula had discovered that death could be more useful when it refused to arrive. He transformed punishment into a kind of language, each act a sentence written in terror. He did not break bones. He bent faith. He turned pain into prophecy, teaching that defiance could be erased not by death, but by the waiting for it. Every method he used was chosen with care: boiling, flaying, impalement. None existed for cruelty alone. Each was a ritual that taught obedience through endurance. In the city, people whispered that even the air began to listen to him. No one disobeyed. No one questioned. The streets were quiet, not because they were safe, but because fear had become a form of governance. Vlad ruled as if terror were a kind of divine order, believing that peace could only be built upon trembling. When word of this forest reached Constantinople, the Ottoman envoys were sent to confront him. They arrived with pride and commands from their sultan, wrapped in the silk of authority. Vlad received them beneath the open sky, where the forest still stood as witness. The envoys tried to speak, but their voices faltered. Around them, the wind moved softly, carrying the faint hum of what once had been voices. They looked down, not out of reverence, but because they could not meet his gaze. In that moment, they understood what no empire had yet learned. The man before them did not rule through armies or wealth. He ruled because he had turned fear itself into a monument that could be seen from miles away. The forest that screamed no longer made a sound, yet every living soul who looked upon it heard the same truth. Vlad III Dracula had given death a purpose, and it obeyed him. The war that followed was not only between empires, but between two brothers who had once shared the same silence. Vlad III Dracula ruled through terror, shaping his realm with fire and fear, while Radu, the younger, served under the Ottoman banner, believing that peace could only exist through obedience. They had both been children in chains, raised in the same palace, fed the same lessons, yet one had chosen to bow and the other to burn. When the Ottoman banners appeared on the horizon, Vlad watched from the walls of his fortress. The sky was dark with storm clouds, and beneath them stood an army vast enough to erase a kingdom. At its head rode Radu, the brother he had once protected, the man who now carried the command of Sultan Mehmed II. Their gazes met across the field, and for a moment, the years of captivity returned like ghosts. Vlad saw in Radu not hatred but pity, and pity to him was the cruelest insult. That night, before battle, Radu came to parley. They met in a ruined chapel where candles fought against the wind. For a time, neither spoke. Then Radu broke the silence. His voice trembled with sorrow more than anger. "Your throne is made of corpses." Vlad looked at him, calm as stone. "And yours," he said, "of chains." Between them hung the weight of every lesson the empire had ever taught. They were not enemies by choice, but by the design of fear itself. When dawn came, Mehmed II marched his army toward Targovishte. What they found was not a battlefield, but a vision of madness. Stretching for miles stood a forest of 20,000 stakes, each carrying what had once been a soldier. The air shimmered with heat and silence. Even the horses refused to move forward. The Sultan, who had conquered cities and crushed kingdoms, ordered a retreat. Vlad had no army strong enough to face an empire, yet he needed none. Fear itself became a weapon sharper than any sword. It guarded his borders better than walls and broke the resolve of men before they even reached his gates. Radu would later tell the Sultan that his brother had become something ungovernable, that he ruled not as a man, but as a shadow. And Vlad, standing alone in the twilight of his fortress, knew it was true. He no longer belonged to the world of kings or brothers. He belonged to the silence that came after screaming, to the kingdom built not from faith or loyalty, but from the echo of terror that even blood could not silence. The empire he once terrified no longer spoke his name. betrayed by allies and hunted by those who once called him protector. Vlad III Dracula was taken across the border in chains. Hungary received him not as a guest, but as a prisoner who could no longer serve a purpose. They locked him in a stone cell where the wind did not reach and the light could not stay. For the first time in years, the world outside his walls was quiet. Yet inside him, the screams had never stopped. He sat for days without speaking, tracing the lines of his hands as if they still carried the shape of the power he had lost. The walls were wet with the breath of winter, and the sound of dripping water counted the hours he could not escape. He once ruled through silence. Now silence ruled him. It filled the room like smoke, curling around his thoughts until every memory was smothered in its weight. He tried to pray, but the words broke apart before reaching his lips. The gods had long abandoned him, or perhaps he had abandoned them first. He remembered the forest outside Targovishte, the way it shone under dawn like a field of red glass. He wondered if the wind still moved through it, if the crows still perched on the stakes that had once been men. Their faces came back to him one by one, until he could no longer tell whether they were his enemies or his reflection. The silence in the cell began to change shape. At night it whispered like old breath, repeating the cries he had silenced in others. It was not punishment. It was inheritance. A man cannot command fear forever without one day serving it. Vlad began to understand that what he had created outside had now taken root within him. Fear no longer protected him. It consumed him slowly, stripping away the armor he had forged from cruelty. One morning, when the guards brought water to his cell, he leaned over the bucket and looked down. The surface trembled in the thin light. For a heartbeat, he expected to see the face of a king. Instead, he saw the faces of those who had screamed beneath his rule. The water shivered, and so did he. In that reflection, he found no redemption, only the quiet truth that the throne he built from terror had followed him into the dark. It no longer needed subjects. It had found its place inside him. They said his death was quick, but no one could agree on how it happened. Some claimed he was struck down by his own men in the confusion of battle. Others whispered that his body was never found, that only his head reached Constantinople. The guards who carried it swore that his eyes did not close, even as the torches burned low and the night pressed in. Those glassy eyes seemed to stare through them, as if death itself had failed to command him. The soldiers covered the head with a cloth, yet they could still feel his gaze burning through the fabric. In time, the story became legend. The forests he once ruled returned to silence, but his name did not. Children were warned to behave. Nobles crossed themselves when the wind rose, and travelers claimed to see a rider moving through the fog at the edge of Wallachia. The empire had killed the man, but it could not bury the idea of him. Vlad III Dracula had become more than a ruler. He was memory shaped into fear, proof that a man could rule longer through terror than through life. His power had never come from victory. It came from memory. Each tale retold his cruelty. Each whisper carried it farther, until his reign became a mirror for all others. His story revealed the oldest truth of power, that every empire needs its monster, and that those who build thrones from virtue often keep their foundations soaked in blood. Vlad's cruelty had not been chaos. It had been order without mercy, justice without forgiveness, faith without light. He became the embodiment of a paradox, a man who used sin to preserve the sacred, who defended his homeland by destroying everything human within himself. In his silence, he showed that fear can bind a kingdom faster than law. and that the line between savior and destroyer is thinner than the edge of a blade. Centuries passed, yet his shadow did not fade. It followed every ruler who believed terror could be tamed, every empire that mistook obedience for peace. Every empire builds a forest like his, only the stakes are invisible now. If you wish to keep uncovering the shadows behind the world's thrones, subscribe to our channel, where the screams of history still echo through the cracks of its marble.